Grand Rounds Zoom version. Before we go on, I'd like to acknowledge that McGill University is situated on unceded territory of the Kenyan Gahaga and is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. So we created McGill Zoom Medical Grand Rounds to bring us together regularly to hear from world-class speakers on topics of broad and significant interest. And I'd like to thank our Associate Chair of Education, Dr. Chen Tolmu, for organizing the McGill Department of Medicine Medical Grand Rounds and for lining up excellent speakers. And coming soon will be Dr. David Naylor, the former president of U of T and the former Dean of Medicine at U of T and a key figure and influencer of science and medicine in Canada. Dr. Gillian Horton, an internist and best-selling author on wellness and the recently published book, We Are All Perfectly Fine. And of course, today's world-renowned leader in artificial intelligence and founder of Mila, that Dr. Chen Tolmu will introduce. So I'd like to now turn over the virtual podium to Dr. Chen Tolmu and take it away,
Great.
Annabelle.
Thank you, Mark. It is a pleasure to introduce Yoshua Bengio as our speaker today. He is a full professor in the Department of Computer Science and Operations Research at the Université de Montréal. He's the founder and scientific director of MILA and the scientific director of the Institut de Valorisation des Données. A graduate of McGill, from which he received his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees, Professor Bengio is considered to be one of the world's leaders in artificial intelligence and deep learning. And among the many honors he has received, these include being named an Officer of the Order of Canada in 2017, being a recipient of the A.M. Turing Award in 2018 and the Killam Prize in 2019. And in 2021, he was the second most cited computer scientist in the world. So it is, I just want to say that it's hard to imagine any aspect of human life that will not be affected or untouched by machine learning, and medicine is certainly no exception. So it is very timely and to have you here with us, and we're very grateful that you have accepted our invitation. So I'll turn over the podium to you.
Thank you, Annabelle, and thanks everyone for having me today. Health is something that I care about, like everyone should, not just mine, but how machine learning can make a difference. And there is quite a few areas within health and medicine where machine learning is being explored or applied. I'll be talking at a very high level on a few topics. Hopefully I can answer questions later to maybe address the things that you're more interested in. So let me try to share my screen, my slides here. All right, and get rid of my face. Good. So I don't need to tell you that there's been a revolution in AI. It's come out of universities and into society in many areas. And the progress has been surprising, even for people like me in the middle of the tornado. Mostly though, while we can celebrate, I think it's important also to understand where it's working and where it's not. And I think that's important for people who want to apply it as well. The greatest progress has been on perception, like analyzing images. And that's why, for example, medical images are such a big thing. But also language to some extent, even though in some fundamental ways, we're still missing something important about language. We have systems like GPT-3 that can produce text that looks natural, but then if you use it to try to answer questions that involve a bit of reasoning, it tends to break down. Unless it's something it's seen earlier, and it's been trained on huge amounts of data. In the figure here, you see the neural nets we trained in 2014. So that's like a long time ago, in the early days of this revolution, to take an image and produce a sentence that the system thinks corresponds to it. Of course, it's been trained on pairs of images and sentences. In general, you need training data. The supervised learning is sort of the easiest to understand, where you tell it, so here's a pair of input and outputs, and you'd like to predict outputs. And the outputs could be probabilistic. For example, here for the same image, it can generate many different sentences. Let me move on. What's going on here? All right. Here. So supervised learning from input-output pairs has been the bread and butter, but one of the big developments that my group participated in is the ability of these neural nets to imagine things, to synthesize new things, to sample from a distribution. So they're really probabilistic models. The output, instead of being a class or something low dimensional like a number, is a whole image in those applications, or something else like a molecule, as I'll tell you later. What you see on the top is the progression of some of these models, the GANs, generative adversarial networks, that we came up with in 2014. And they're generating here images of faces. So they're trained on images of faces, but now they can imagine new faces of people that don't exist. The bottom left are, I think, around circa 2018, and now they can be even better, but these are not real people. These are like imagined faces. You can also condition these neural nets. In other words, you can stick an input, just like in supervised learning, you have inputs and outputs. The output is still this high dimensional thing like an image, but the input could be another high dimensional thing like a sentence. Here on the bottom right, it takes a sentence like, this bird is red with white and has a very short beak, and it tries to generate an image that might correspond to it. And of course, there are many possible images it could generate again. Another area that's been quite amazing is the progress in reinforcement learning. So reinforcement learning, so I talked about supervised learning, you have input-output pairs. I talked about generative models that can output high dimensional things like images or molecules or graphs. Reinforcement learning are trained with feedback that doesn't tell them what the output should be, and usually the feedback is delayed, and there's a sequence of actions by the AI system before you get feedback. So typically playing a game where you only know at the end how you're doing, or maybe you're getting points along the way in the video game. And in 2016, of course, you may have heard about this breakthrough where DeepMind had just been bought by Google, put out a system called AlphaGo that beat the world champion in Go. And that was not expected by Go experts or AI experts for a while, but yeah, it happened. Now, I mean, playing a game like Go or chess seems and beating humans seems impressive, but it's very different from real life. And the main reason is, in Go or chess, we know the rules of the game, and we just have to find a good strategy, a good policy. Just is hard, obviously, but in many real world problems, the hard problem is getting what the rules are. Like, how does the world work? How does a body work? How does a cell work? So we don't usually know the physics or the chemistry perfectly, so that we can answer the question, if I do this, what will be the consequence? Whereas if you play Go, if I put a stone here, I know that I don't win right away, and then there are clear rules for deciding how many points you make and so on. So getting closer to medicine a little bit. So this is a more recent breakthrough, 2021, AlphaFold, again from DeepMind. And this time they use advances, actually some of which coming from my group as well, on what we call attention mechanisms, inspired by how the brain works and cognition. Where these attention mechanisms are put inside those neural nets, so they can focus computation on some aspects of the data. And that actually opens the door to processing complicated data structures like graphs. So, graphs that can represent a 3D structure of a molecule, of course, a sequence of amino acids, and then learn in those domains here to map the amino acid sequence to the 3D structure. And whereas for decades, the progress had been essentially zero to try to solve this 3D structure, protein folding problem, suddenly they really broke through the ceiling and very closely approached the performance, the accuracy that you get with crystallography. And I guess by today, it's probably even better. And they've put out recently the code for running this system, and they actually also put out a database of a huge set of proteins. I don't know how many millions that are known, for which they now have predicted the 3D structure, because we only know the 3D structure of a small fraction of them. So there's been progress in the last few years. I mentioned attention, but also memory, again inspired by human brains, handling almost any data structure, having systems that can not just operate on large inputs like images, but can synthesize and imagine them, but also active learning, I'll talk about at the end, where the learner is involved in an interaction. So reinforcement learning is an example of that. You don't care just about the immediate outcome of your decisions, but also maybe there's a sequence of decisions and you might see the outcome later, or it's a cumulative outcome, which is the typical situation in many real world situations, like deciding about a therapy for a patient. And some of the things that are ongoing, I wouldn't say they are solved by far, are extending these capabilities to enable these neural nets to handle reasoning and causality in ways that are more like the way humans do it. All right. Now let's go back a little bit to basics of machine learning. So machine learning is a discipline now. It's huge. There's around 20,000 people coming to some of the major conferences yearly. It's a branch of AI. AI is being about building intelligent machines, and deep learning was a very small part of machine learning until it became very, very successful. The kinds of things I just talked about. So it's now present in a large proportion of the machine learning papers. Now, the crux of machine learning is about the idea that we're going to put knowledge into computers by providing them with data, by experience or examples. In practice, in any problem, there will be a combination of knowledge we already have, and somehow we try to put that into the computer, as well as knowledge that the computer extracts from that data. It's always going to be a combination. Classical symbolic AI, like rule-based symbolic AI, only used human-crafted knowledge in the form of rules and facts and so on. The modern deep learning is focusing on the data part, and yet has to be able to incorporate the kinds of explicit rules that you would find in teachings of medicine, for example. And one way to understand how knowledge is incorporated in machine learning with current systems is similar to how humans build up understanding of something at an intuitive level. So something is intuitive, meaning that you know what to do, but you can't explain why you're doing it. And you can be very, very good at it. But it's just too complex somehow to come to be broken down into pieces that you can explain. So that's sort of thing that current machine learning is good at. and that classical AI was not. Now, yeah, there's still a huge gap between current state of the art in AI and machine learning and human intelligence. And people, and some companies or people might try to let's say give the impression that AI is a bit like magic, and it's not. Of course, it's a science like any of the other things we're doing that works. For example, the systems we have understand complex things like playing Go or how proteins fold, at least to first approximation. But they don't understand things like psychology. In other words, how human minds work, or how society works. What is moral and what is not. And it's important to understand these kinds of limitations, because when they are deployed in the real world, you clearly need to keep that in mind, because they don't have more understanding of society and humans than your toaster or something. So one thing I also want to warn you against is people who make very clear, apparently, predictions about what's going to happen next in AI and when we're going to get super intelligent machines and all that. It's impossible to make these predictions. Those who tell you that today they can solve your problems with AI, you should also be careful, because yes, they're impressive things that have been done and it will be done even more in the future. But usually it's a lot of work. It's not like we take some black box VCP formula machine learning is a bunch of formulas and code for implementing what they do, and then apply that and bingo, we got something great. Usually it requires a lot of work and trial and error and expertise by human about the domain where it's going to be applied, because usually the information that is implicit in the data that we use to train those systems is just not sufficient to do a good job. So we have to combine the domain experts' knowledge and the data and the machine learning algorithms that somehow combine them in order to get really good systems. And because machine learning is relying so much on data, it also means the amount of data is important. And it's not just the amount, it's sort of the relevance of the data to the problem you're trying to solve. You might have a lot of data that's not really relevant. And it could be useful, but not as much as data that's very close to the problem you want to solve. Also, just having large files is not sufficient. Like if I have one image and it's very big, it's not as good as if I have a million small images that tell me about many different aspects of the world. So I have this one image could be very, very high resolution, but well, it doesn't really help me to generalize to other points of view that are not represented in this one picture. So similarly, it's hard to know ahead of time. Just if you tell me, oh, I have 10,000 examples for this problem, is it going to work? It's hard to say. But if you tell me you have 10 examples, I can tell you it's not going to work. And of course, the more data, the better. Now, let's talk a little bit about medical applications. And I listed a few here. I'm sure I'm missing some. In general, what's interesting with machine learning is to look at places where it might be difficult or take too much time for humans, for doctors to extract the information from the data we care about. It's not like humanly feasible to look at the whole genome of a person, and even looking at all the SNPs is just too difficult. We might focus on the few ones, but we need computers to help us decide where to look. And similarly, if you look at very high dimensional image data, maybe 3-dimensional images or videos, for example, of the intestine, yeah, a human could look at these things, but it's a lot of information to take in. And human brains are very good with visual information to take a lot of bits of information, but still we can miss some things, and it could be useful to have machines help us identify places to pay attention to. Similarly, the patient history, it could be a big file, and yes, if you take time, you can have a look at all of it. But if you have a new patient or you have to take a quick decision, really want to have tools to help you quickly extract relevant information for some decision. In classical statistical models, we could handle like low-dimensional data and make linear regressions and things like that have advantages, like they're more interpretable than these big neural nets. But it wasn't obvious how to deal with high-dimensional data like images, but also like text. So one thing I mentioned, the progress on natural language. One thing that modern AI systems can do very easily is stick in texts as input and even as output. So you could potentially take an image in and produce a doctor's report. I'm not saying it's going to work, but the technology is there. We know how to build these architectures. You probably don't have enough data for this right now, but it might come a day when this could be possible. And you can handle fairly easily things like missing data, multiple modalities, censored data. Also, the output of these things don't have to be just categories. They could be probabilities. They could be about things that are going to happen in the future. Of course, when you train them looking back and a posteriori, what predictions you should have made in the past about some event that already happened, but that is in the future of the time of that prediction. And when you make predictions or classifications, you can do it in a probabilistic way. So you can say things like, with some probability, this is what I expect, or maybe this is the expected value of some quantity, but there's some uncertainty that I can also predict. As I said earlier, you can work on data that is structured in complicated ways, like graphs for molecules, and I'll talk about drug discovery later. And you can also use these things to help in searching in the space of therapies or in the space of molecules. You can first, you can use these systems to you can train them in the classical supervised way to predict properties. So associate molecular structure with some property, like is it going to be toxic? But then you can also use other kinds of machine learning, like the reinforcement learning that plays games, to propose new candidates that, if you were to choose them, would give you a high reward that they have the desired properties. And you can use that to plan experiments. You can do that in a pure, in a kind of medical way, like if you're trying to find a therapy, maybe even a personalized therapy. But you can also use these same tools, that's more ongoing work, to try to discover the causal structure, for example, the gene regulatory network of cells. I mean, this is not something that has been solved, but would be amazing if we can make progress on that, and there is work in that direction. So I mentioned image-related applications have been probably the first applications of these techniques. I would say it was the low-hanging fruit. And some of the lessons from this as the challenge involved in the tension between the issues of privacy and the need for bringing all that data together for machine learning to do its work, to train the predictors. So that's something we haven't completely solved at a social level, and the Quebec government is working on a new bill to try to make it easier. Hopefully, that's going to be helping research in applications of machine learning to AI. Machine learning to medicine. Okay, so this is an example of a paper where, I worked on a few years ago, where we are in a setting where we want to analyze medical images of the brain, but for different data sources, maybe different hospitals, different patients, we get a different subsets of measurements. So each column here corresponds to a different measurement, and we're trying to predict the Hemis column, the second for last. I'm sorry, we're trying to predict the last column, and the one before is the prediction. And we may only have access to, say, FLAIR and T2W, which are two types of measurements, but maybe on other data we have FLAIR and T1W. So we can train these systems with different subsets of measurements, and it's yeah, how we do that. I'm not going to explain that. It's not a big deal, really. You can also combine text and images. So there's some work we also did in my group a few years ago in order to do, in this case, X-ray diagnosis. Yeah, this is similar. So you can see the kind of input, which may be a radiology report, and also images. You can use these techniques, and now it's commercial. Like, you can almost buy these things to analyze images of cells, for example, for pathology, to identify the types of cells that may be in a pathology image, as well as count them. So that's something that can take a lot of time to a human, but now we have these techniques that really do a good job. And again, this is something we did in my group a while ago. Let me skip the language thing. So the gist here is we can learn, and by the way, this is all, as it says 2000, right? This is work we did 20 years ago, where we learned for each word in the vocabulary a representation. Here we project that in 2D, so we can see different words that have similar meaning end up close to each other in this 2D space. And that becomes these representations. It's going to be more than two, but for visualization, we just showed two, become the input for next stages, downstream stages of processing. And you learn jointly these representations at the same time as the task that you're trying to solve. On the image side, the main technology that has been used for now a couple of decades is convolutional neural nets. So they break down the problem into several stages where the original image is going to be transformed, and you learn these transformations. There are these neural net layers, but they're spatially structured, and each layer is taking a kind of a set of images, if you want, from the previous layer, where at each position you have some features. So it discovers these internal features that help it do the task, and then the features at some level become the input for computing features at the next level, and the whole thing is trained end to end, meaning you don't need to tell it ahead of time what, how this what each level is supposed to be doing. Just give it the inputs and the targets, and it learns to map one to the other. So typically the original convolutional nets, they had an images input and then maybe some category probabilities as output. But you can also have systems that take images as input and images as output. And these have been used a lot in the case of medical images to do segmentation. So for each pixel in the input, you might want to have a label to be produced. And we have these architectures that go through gradually lower resolution representations to try to extract something a bit more global about the image, in order to eventually go back in the gray on the left path to the high resolution representations and eventually the outputs. Another thing that came up recently, something that came up much more recently is federated learning. That really is useful in medical settings, but also in other settings where companies want to somehow share the data but not share it. So the data is going to stay in each of the sites, for example, a hospital, but they're going to share the model, and the model is going to be trained with all the data. So what's going to happen is the data stays local, but the parameters of the neural nets are going to be exchanged back and forth between a central server and each of the sites. And we have ways of training those federated learning models fairly efficiently, in spite of the fact that now you have all this communication overhead between the sites and the central server. Now, for the last few minutes, let me talk about drug discovery, because this is the, let's say, the medical application I'm currently involved in. So we can do pretty classical things and predict supervised learning, predict properties of drugs. The only special aspect of this is the input is now this graph that describes the molecule typically. But otherwise it's fairly standard. Now the thing I want to talk about is going in, once you have trained a model like this, how do you search the space of molecules? But you can generalize this in, think about how do you search the space of therapies? It could be the search of drug combinations. Think of a therapy as a set of decisions, and you can't possibly try all of them. So here, the set of drugs, maybe small drugs, is of size like 10 to the 60. There's no way we're going to be able to screen all of them for some target disease. So we need a way to acquire information about what works and what doesn't work. That's going to efficiently experiment, try just the things that we would like, and come up with the knowledge from the selected data. So instead of being given a data set, would like to be able to ask for the data. So we're getting into the realm where machine learning becomes part of the scientific discovery process. That's one way to think about it. And one reason why, in the case of drug discovery, it's becoming really appealing is because we have new technologies, biotechnologies, for example, synthetic biology and robotics that allow to do very high throughput screening. So we can potentially synthesize and then test huge number of potential candidates. So that means at each round, we get a lot of data, and that data can then feed next stages. And then the other reason why it's becoming possible to do that is because of advances in machine learning itself. And I won't go into these keywords, but it's exciting, and it's important because it's more appealing to the machine learning PhD students if there is also some machine learning science that needs to be done in order to solve these problems. Right. So drug discovery, searching for drugs, searching for therapies in general is searching a needle in a haystack. There's no way we'll be able to even consider, even in a computer, all of them. So we need to be a bit smarter here. What did I? Yeah. Ultimately, where we want to go is, in a way, inspired by how human scientists proceed. We're trying to understand what we're modeling, right? And we build these models. The models have to be consistent with the data. And we already know quite a bit about cells and molecular biology and things like that. But there's also so much we don't know. And so ideally, we'd like to take the knowledge we have and the data we have and the data we could collect and build up hypotheses. And it's not just one hypothesis, because typically there'll be uncertainty about the causal structure, for example, the pathways. So we need to build these probabilistic models of what could be explaining the data. And that's a very hot and interesting field in machine learning, of incorporating causality, but also contributing to new algorithms for what's called causal discovery. For example, figuring out what is the causal graph, like, which protein is influencing which one in a kind of as a direct and for a direct effect. So let's go back to this problem of searching. The way that we have been going at it is looking at, at a high level, we have the experimental bench on the right, where we're going to get some data. And in the middle, we have maybe a supervised learning that builds a model of that data. And then on the left, we have this new kind of thing that I want to say a few words about, these generative models. So I talked about synthesizing images, and I said you could use similar things to synthesize molecules. So now the general idea is we're going to train the generative model to propose, say, new molecules, and we're going to score those molecules by the model, because we're going to do that to train that generative model so that it generates molecules that would have a good score or a good bit of new information according to the model. Once we have trained the generative model, then we can use it to propose candidates that we're actually going to use to do experiments. And then that gives us new data. We can use that new data to update the model so that the model is consistent with the augmented data. And now we can continue training the generative model so it proposes new candidates and that are consistent with the modified model. So that's sort of the process that we are currently doing in various applications. Yeah, I'm going to skip that. But let me say sort of one particular application I care about is antimicrobial resistance. And there are two reasons for this. One, it's a major global health threat on a scale almost comparable to the current COVID-19 pandemic, but growing quickly and steadily, so that by 2050, if nothing happens with our technology to deal with it, or the way that we use antibiotics, we're going to be in huge trouble. And there's going to be on the order of 10 million deaths per year globally, and it's going to cost the economy on the order of $100 trillion in the next 20 years. So, so one reason to look at this is that it's such an important problem. Another reason is, I mean, of course, and there are other important medical problems, but it's one where industry is not really looking. There is a market failure that means it's not profitable to discover new antibiotics right now. And the third point is we have data. It's easy to collect large amounts of data for this. And then finally, there are like challenges in the machine learning itself that make it appealing for grad students at Mila, for example. Yeah, so I think I'm going to stop here. One last thing I want to say is for these kinds of problems, I've been on an international committee called GPAY, Global Partnership on AI, bringing about 20 countries together. And one of the recommendations of our recent work is about things like how to use AI in drug discovery, and in particular to deal with these market failures. And there's a real need for governments to get involved in stimulating the required research, but also innovation. In other words, the things that happen not in universities, but that happen normally in industry, but industry is not tackling because of a lack of commercial interest, but even though it's really important for society. So governments need to provide the right incentives to make that R&D happen. I'll stop here. Thank you very much. And I'll be happy to answer your questions now.
Great, thank you very much. I'll invite everyone to enter their questions into the chat. And I suppose I'll defer to Mark if you have any questions or comments.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's absolutely fascinating. I'm going to ask you the question you probably don't like answering. And you mentioned that AI, is not magic, and it's very difficult to make predictions about where AI will land. But speaking to a group of physicians, and we're not necessarily all diagnosticians, but are our days numbered?
No.
All right, thank you.
Your job may have to change, though. I mean, it's like, there's going to be new tools, basically, and I think doctors will have to get to understand them and use them to be even more efficient than they are now. That's at least for the foreseeable future. And then there's like the science fiction future, but that's kind of, I don't want to go there.
Well, maybe follow up with a question, which is, part of our job is explaining to the patients the pathophysiology or why we're recommending something. So if we can't look into the black box and understand why the computer has reached this conclusion, how do we explain that to our patients and get them to agree to the proposed treatment when there's already an absence sometimes of trust in the medical profession?
Right. No, this is a commonly asked question, and well, so first of all, there are already lots of things that doctors will prescribe without actually understanding it, not because they personally don't understand, because science doesn't understand these things. So, we have drugs, we know they work, we don't know why. Sometimes we do, but often we don't. So we have to realize that there's also a limitation to our abilities to explain why something works. But what does matter in the drug example, and similarly for, say, a tool like based on AI, is that we've done the proper testing to know, at least at a statistical level, that it does in general what it should be doing. So that's one part of the answer. Another part of the answer is we can look into the box. So they're not really black boxes. They are just complicated boxes. And there's a whole like sub area of research in machine learning to try to come up with what's called attribution. So like if the input is an image, we can, some techniques to identify which parts of the image seem to be most responsible for what we obtain. In fact, I recently just saw a talk where the same kind of techniques are applied to answer a question like, if this drug seems to work well, which part of it is responsible, like, or most responsible, of course, or a protein, right? So there are ways to query, if you want, to extract information from these for particular cases. So, it's very difficult to come up with a general rule that corresponds to the neural net, because there's, it would be a huge rule. You couldn't really put it in words. But for a particular patient or a particular case, well, it's much easier to analyze. And then you can point to specific variables or combinations of variables that are, and you can say, well, for example, if you didn't have this particular thing, then, I would not recommend what I'm doing now. And then my third part of the answer is, well, this is a rapidly evolving science, and there's a lot of interest in building systems that would be a little bit more like humans in their ability to somewhat, not perfectly, just like humans, explain why they're doing what they're doing, and that it would come out as a kind of reasoning. Maybe it's going to be an approximate reasoning, but similarly to the way humans explain why they take decisions. So this is things that are ongoing in research, and not something that I can tell you next year you can use it. But I have good hopes that we'll be able to get there.
Great, thank you. I see a few hands up, so I'll start with Dr. Pai. Nitika Pai, you had a comment?
Hi. Yeah, I thank you, Dr. Bengio. Enjoyed your talk. A lot of us have thought about this, and I as the foremost thinker in this space, what do you think about technological singularity? When are we going to achieve that point? I mean, does it scare you?
That's BS. It's just science fiction. Okay?
Thank you.
it's just out of the brain of some people, and he convinced a bunch of others.
Yeah.
But as far as I'm concerned, there's no scientific basis for all that. And now, you know, anything in the future that's complicated, like, you know, what's going to happen in 20 years or 50 years, even with things that we have good models for, like climate, is very difficult to predict. And the more you look into the future, the more it's hazy. And technology is rapidly evolving, so it's even, you know, it's very hard to make those predictions. So it could be that we are able to build machines that more or less match human intelligence in 20 years from now, or maybe it's going to take 200 years. I have no idea.
But with intuition and consciousness, do you think the machines will be able to kind of get there? Okay,
so here is my belief.
Okay.
That unless we destroy our societies, and there are many ways this can happen, environment, politics, there's no reason to believe that we won't be able to build machines that are at least as intelligent as us, because we are machines, right? And on the one hand, you know, neuroscience and cognitive science is making progress. It's going to continue to make progress. It's going to be helped by research in AI, and you know, AI by its own is also making progress. So we'll figure it out. We'll find ways to build machines that are at least as smart as humans. Now, there's also good reasons to think that there may be kind of exponential walls of complexity, of computational complexity, to build machines that could be like very, very much smarter than us. We don't know. It's complete unknown, right? For sure, they will have some abilities that we don't, because they will have access to much more data. They will probably have access to much more memory, and you know, they will have advantages. So they will be smarter than us, but maybe not qualitatively so much, right? They'll just be like able to access more information faster. We don't
Dr. Affolello, your hand is up.
Yeah. Hi, thank you for the fantastic talk. One question I have is about interpretability of AI, and specifically in the imaging space. You know, coming from a conventional statistics background, we seek to really understand the data and then make a prediction in a second time. And having kind of immersed myself in AI over the last couple of years, I see that it's really the other way around in machine learning and deep learning, where we're generating predictions, and then sometimes the interpretation of those predictions is an afterthought, or certainly not as mature as a science. So just wanted to know your thoughts on if you think it's ever going to flip to a time or a landscape where ML is really investing more in interpretability, especially for imaging, where it could be complex to know what in the image is generating this excellent prediction.
Well, I think there are actually a lot of people working on this. So, you know, there's a time between the research and you know, that you get it on your desk. So I think there will be more progress in those tools. The first products, if I can say, that came out didn't have any interpretability, because we just focused on answering the question and then making those predictions. So I'm hopeful, but then, as I mentioned in my presentation, I'm also hopeful that will be fundamental progress in the ability of the neural nets we'll build in the future to reason in ways similar, and to explain their reasoning in a way very much inspired by human cognition. So then it would be a very different style of interaction. In fact, probably natural language directly that you would have with those machines. I'm not saying like when this has come up, but this is like my 10-year research program. And we have very specific plans to get there.
Great, thanks. I'll just finish with the people who have raised their hands. Dr. Yujing Zhou, please. If you're still.
Hi. Hello. Hi. Now I'm able to turn on my camera. But would you be able to allow me to do that, or I can just ask a question? I have two questions. First of all, thank you very much for your talk, Prof. Bengio. There we go. So a lot of the points that you've illustrated had something to do with a biologically inspired modeling approach.
Because that's the style that I care about.
Yeah. So I haven't quite dived into that yet. So I'm curious about when you're dealing with a new problem at hand, what's your sort of thought process to make it a biologically inspired approach when you're trying to build your models? And my second question has to do with federated learning. And obviously data sharing can be a bottleneck when it comes to model building, when you need a lot of data. What are some of the hurdles if you're trying to make this approach work? What are some of the hurdles at hand, such as at the regulatory level and so on? And third question has something to do with self-supervised learning, but I saw that already in the chat, so I just have two questions.
Right. So in the chat also there was another comment, what your advice would be to the relevant health and regulatory authorities in Quebec to encourage data sharing, which seems to be critical to the success of your vision.
Yeah. So I and others, and others much more than I did, have been lobbying the Quebec government to change their regulatory structure to make it easier for researchers, both inside the hospital system and outside. And they've been moving in that direction. And then there's, as I said, a bill that's being drafted. I think it's going to make a big difference. We'll see how it's implemented. It's going to take a few years to carry through. In terms of the federated learning, I mean, there's a bit of a hit in speed at which you can do things, and it depends on the communication bottlenecks, but hospitals usually well wired. It's way better to do that than not be able to share, but of course it's way better if you can just put everything in one place. So what I understand from this new bill is that it will be possible throughout the hospital system in Quebec to have access to everyone's health record. But that access is not going to be automatic, right? It's going to be a process, and each hospital or some authority is going to give access, but it's not going to be the current bottlenecked centralized system that makes it essentially impossible. So I'm very hopeful.
Great. An interesting question from Dr. Rosenblatt. Just like some drugs that work, we don't know why. With AI, will you not come up with some drugs that should work, but then do not? They fail when you actually test.
For sure.
So,
well, yeah, okay. Of course. And the reason is always the same, that we're getting, we're coming up with those candidates from partial information. We don't have a full understanding of what's going on, and the data we collect is finite. So it's not necessarily even possible to figure out what is really going on. And in fact, because of this, the strategy that we and others are focusing on is coming up with generative machinery that proposes candidates, that proposes not just one candidate, but a diverse set of candidates. Diverse means you don't want to have like 10 molecules that are like just one small variation away from each other. You would like ideally to have 10 molecules that correspond to very different styles of solutions, and maybe they can even be combined, drug combination. But that's really important, because maybe 2/3 of them are going to disappear through the filter of, say, in vivo experiments. Disappears, fail for some reason.
There's a comment about from Dr. Gilfix, Nature Methods, January 2022, declared AlphaFold and Rose TTA fold as methods of the year. This provides the basis of a revolution in the interpretation of effects of mutation on protein structure. Thoughts?
Yeah. I think it's amazing. And the good news is other labs are now kind of replicating what they've been doing. Now they've published their their technique and the architecture of the neural nets and so on. Other groups are doing it. It's fairly computationally expensive, but it's yeah. But now it's also only one step towards what we really need, because there's only like one protein that we're getting, and we're getting one dominant fold. But really, we know that in general there's going to be a lot of conformations. So we need a distribution over these conformations. And then there's already people working on this. And then the other thing we need is not a single protein, but the complex of, say, 2 proteins or a protein and a drug. Because at the end of the day, if you want to find a good drug, then that's the problem you need to solve. And again, there are people working on this. It's hard, but a big door has been opened. And so I think that's really going to transform the field.
Great. There's a question from Dr. Zhang with his hand up.
Hi, Dr. Bengio. Thank you for your presentation. My question stems from the observation that we have relatively small amounts of like manually generated supervised data, but we have like basically unlimited amounts of like self-supervised data.
Right.
I know there's like a project going on at Facebook where they're trying to predict the hashtags from the pictures on the Instagram. And there's people who have been working on like YouTube videos and learning from them, just like learning like a representation of our world from them. Do you think this is the way forward to kind of get like to get to a point where neural networks will be more robust, more generalizable, and like less costly to train, and also perhaps perhaps it will be more interpretable to us?
Yeah.
Or do you think it's just one of those detours we'll take on the
no,
journey?
Okay. Yes and no. So let me elaborate. I think using all the sources of data, including unlabeled, is super important, because they contain a lot of information. And we've made a lot of progress in doing that with self-supervised learning, but it's not sufficient. So my own take on what else do we need is the representations that these current self-supervised learning methods are learning are not particularly good. They're better than whatever we had before, but they're nothing like the way we think. They're nothing like the kind of concepts that we manipulate with language or that we reason with. And but I think we know a lot about cognition and conscious processing in the brain and how we manipulate these high-level concepts. So the top of the food chain in the deep learning should be things like words, right? Things that have meaning that we can communicate. But that's not what we get with the current techniques. And we should, but it's not going to happen just by hoping for like bigger data sets or bigger compute. We need to put these constraints in, and we know where to take inspiration for that, which is, as I said, like things like the global workspace theory of cognitive neuroscience. So I think we'll be able to do that. It's going to take a while, but just the self-supervised or semi-supervised learning is not sufficient. It's good, but it's not sufficient.
Right. And so there's a
Thank
question
you.
from Dr. Khan, and it sort of goes along with one of the things you talked about, which was the private-public partnership in looking at ways of combating antimicrobial resistance.
Yeah.
Sort of who is going to own whatever comes out of that?
Yeah.
And his question is, the development of COVID vaccines shows how private industry can be very effective, yet also consistently fail at achieving equity. So the massive amounts of data from our publicly funded healthcare system is likely incredibly valuable for the AI industry, but then handing it over or even selling it to private industry to develop AI-based programs would be analogous to handing over a very valuable natural resource for private wealth generation. So what are the mechanisms?
These are great questions and very important ones that need governments to step in. So I'm a big believer in open science, and I believe actually that the current innovation process in industry is highly inefficient because they all hide, they don't share the data and the knowledge that they acquire for the most part. And in a world where they would share, just think about all the failed experiments on drugs that didn't work, that a pharma is producing but hiding, right? They're all doing it on their own. It's kind of a super big waste if you think about it. So, you know, but there are good reasons for this from an economic perspective. For their survival, it's the right thing to do. So we just need to change, the rules of the game, the rules of the economic game. And governments can do that. They can incentivize sharing. And I think the easiest place where they can start doing it is in places where the government is paying for the research. So if governments realize that they need to stimulate innovation, for example, to discover new antibiotics, they're going to pay a good part of the costs, and then they could attach constraints. They say, well, yeah, but we're going to pay for 80% of that cost, but you're going to have to make your data available. And then who's going to own this? Well, I think that's part of the discussion that needs to happen. How do we make sure that there's sufficient incentive for the companies? And there are many ways those incentives could be designed so that, you know, I mean, patents are only one way to get an incentive. That's the thing that we've been focusing on for the last 150 years. But I think there are other options. There's also another completely different kind of solution. If we were in the 50s or 60s, what governments would do is, you know, create government research centers, like we have the Connaught Labs in Toronto, and you know, and they were providing the vaccines for Canada, both at the level of research and producing them. So that's another option. I don't think it's a very popular one these days, but governments could create like institutes that will do the work, and of course will share all of the information, and it will be public domain, and we can, you know, gladly share it with other countries. So yeah, there's, I think, a lot of work in economics, political science, law, and the people who care about the issues, like doctors, to find new ways to incentivize the work that is needed, the research and the innovation that is needed to solve some of these big problems. Now, I don't claim I know how to do it, but I know we need to change things.
So I think on that note, you know, maybe we'll draw to a conclusion. It seems like just as machine learning and artificial intelligence is forcing us to reimagine a lot of how we do things, you know, it's not just in the knowledge, but also in the structures of our society, in who has access to what information and how it's used. I think there's a lot of reflection, and it's a little bit terrifying that it's all accelerating at a pace that's very fast, and that most of us in our day-to-day don't have the opportunity or the bandwidth to really think about those big questions. So I think we all really appreciate this very thought-provoking and stimulating discussion that you've led with us. And I think that we tested by the very big attendance that you've had here. So thank you to everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.